resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. I call the clerk.
Private members' business. Notice number 7 relating to the cost of electricity in Queensland.
Deputy Speaker, I move the motion relating to the cost of electricity in Queensland and the terms in which it appears on the notice paper.
And I give you the call, Member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Labor government of Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland is the worst manager of an electricity grid in this country, at a huge, rapidly emerging cost to household consumers, to businesses, to the economy and to jobs. Jay Weatherall's management in South Australia is clearly awful, as repeated blackouts there have shown. You can't have a reliable power system so heavily reliant on wind unless you have a backup, and Jay Weatherall has none, other than an extension cord over the border to a shrinking reserve supply in Victoria. Daniel Andrews' management in Victoria is woeful, as the closure of the Hazelwood Power Station earlier this year and the moratorium on gas exploration attests. But Ms Palaszczuk's government in Queensland is far and away the worst, given the vast, high-quality, energy-producing resources available in my home state. We should have utterly reliable, affordable power in Queensland, now and well into the future. But we don't, and the future is increasingly bleak. 5 years ago, the average price of power in my home state reflected the fact that its generators had access to some of the best reserves of coal and gas in the world. Power was just over $29 per megawatt hour, 29, the second cheapest in the national electricity market at the time, behind only Victoria, which also has access to vast reserves of gas and to even cheaper brown rather than the high-quality black coal of Queensland. Now, however, in Queensland, we have the second most expensive power in the NEM, ahead only of South Australia. The average price in Queensland for 2017 to date is $93.81 per megawatt hour, down very slightly from when I worded the motion that we now address, but still far and away the worst in the NEM, excepting for the price in Jay Weatherall's state, where the average currently sits at $108.88 and is no doubt headed further north. Queensland is now also significantly worse off than New South Wales, where the average price is $81.36 for 2017 to date. We are far worse than the $74.75 in Tasmania and way behind Victoria, where the average is $65.71, but where the price will no doubt rocket as the impact of the closure of its largest generator at Hazelwood kicks in. It is going to be a long, hot summer in Victoria, and the price there is going to go through the roof. The problem in South Australia and Victoria are well known, but the issue for resource-rich Queensland has to be, how has it come to this? How has the NEM state, with by far the richest energy-producing resources in the market, ended up with some of the highest power prices? The answer appears to be incompetence, built on greed, standard operating procedures. History shows us, for Labor governments in Queensland, it's going backwards. Wayne Goss and Kevin Rudd corporatised the Queensland power industry and began a Labor habit of raiding the annual earnings of the industry through dividends, through income tax equivalents and through special dividends, which all ended up hurting consumers. The power system in Queensland has never really been back in equilibrium since, and the government of Anastasia Palaszczuk has continued to do what Wayne Goss had started, which was to annually, habitually rob the industry, with dividends charged to the generators, charged to the transmission agency, and charged to the distributors and retailers regularly at and even beyond their annual net profits. You can't do that to your electricity supply industry and expect them to provide cheap power. By doing it, you are obviously driving prices up, and Palaszczuk's behaviour in this space over the last 2 to 3 years has put Goss and subsequent Labor governments in the shade in terms of the scale of the highway robbery she's been undertaking with consumers, the patsies. In 2014-15, she hit on government-owned enterprises in Queensland, which included the power sector, for $10 billion. Powerlink, the transmitter of power in Queensland, had a net profit of $218 million for that year, and the government seized every single cent. On top of that, the government also demanded from Powerlink, via a ministerial directive no less, a further $1.2 billion, which was paid to the Queensland Treasury Corporation to help pay down the nearly $80 billion of debt that the Palaszczuk government had racked up, because it had been spending like there's no tomorrow, exactly as we've come accustomed to with Labor governments also here in this place. In the 2015-16 annual report of Powerlink, it was indicated that the special ministerial directive demanding $1.2 billion was a major factor in an extension to $820 million of borrowings by the agency. In other words, the $1.2 billion that the Palaszczuk government ordered Powerlink to part with in 2014-15 was a debt shuffle for which Queenslanders will pay, one way or another, but certainly through higher transmission charges in their ever-growing power bills. The government paid down some of its debt with that cash and simply shifted the debt back to Powerlink. And the end result of that is going to be obvious: even more power price increases in Queensland. Stanwell Corporation, a big generator with multiple assets, made $161.6 million in after-tax profits in 2015-16. Every cent of that went to the government as a dividend, plus a special dividend of $150 million. In the 2017-18 budget, just handed down, there were announcements that Powerlink will be hit up for another $150 million and Stanwell for a further $100 million. Deputy Speaker, this is serial madness. It is incompetence, it is greed, and it is deceit. It condemns Queenslanders to higher power prices for many years to come, especially when combined with Labor's ideological commitment to intermittent renewable energy. Off a current base of 4.5% renewables, Labor wants to hit 50% in Queensland by 2030. Inevitably, mostly from wind and solar, which it is determined to continue to heavily subsidise, as the recent budget also makes clear. And the scale of that subsidy is itself frightening. The Queensland Productivity Commission estimates that the cost of the extremely generous feed-in tariffs that the Queensland government is providing to hundreds of thousands of Queensland homes with solar panels on their roofs will cost $4.1 billion up to 2028, the year the scheme ends. And this explains another aspect of why my state, despite its richness in resources, has such high power prices. That subsidy, which at its peak was 44 cents per kilowatt hour, or 50 cents per kilowatt hour from at least one retailer, being Energex, has simply been passed on in higher power prices to all those consumers who do not have panels on their roofs. And the proof of the pain that this is causing consumers is the government's response in its budget. The government now says that it will carry the cost of that subsidy for the next 3 years at a cost of around $770 million, which is, of course, another way of saying that the taxpayer will meet it. No doubt, out of the 2028, at a cost of billions, out until that year, beyond 10 years from now. It's all about swings and roundabouts, it's smokes and mirrors. Such is the scale of the disaster of power pricing in Queensland, Deputy Speaker, that any full and transparent inquiry would no doubt reach the obvious conclusion that the Palaszczuk Labor government is the worst power grid manager in this country. Worse even than Jay Witherell in South Australia and Daniel Andrews in Victoria. And that indeed says a lot.
That's a big effort.
It's a big
That's
effort.
a big effort.
And the problem that we have always seen, Deputy Speaker, with Labor governments this country over, but particularly in Queensland, is that their incompetence is at times conscious incompetence. They know they're incompetent. And they are happy to price gouge, they are happy to rip off consumers, rip off businesses to pay for their spending. It's ridiculous and it has to stop. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the honourable member. Is there a seconder for this motion?